Hello and welcome. I just wanted to share the presentation I gave on Tuesday at the QE Journal Club. The paper I chose was Desflurane Should Disappear, the Global and Financial Rationale. Much appreciation for anyone who missed the Journal Club and is now taking the time for this quick catch-up. So this paper is admittedly an opinion piece and not a specific randomized controlled trial or standalone meta-analysis. It was authored by Matthew Mayer of Virginia and published in Anesthesia and Analgesia just over a year ago. The background to this discussion is that global desflurane emissions are huge and are increasing year by year. Market projections tell us that desflurane use will increase by 5% each year up until 2026, when the global market will be worth in excess of $350 million. It's a huge industry. To summarize Mayer's article, he suggests that there is no real good clinical reason to use desflurane, and there are both strong, convincing environmental and financial reasons for not using it. Mayer describes the history of desflurane from its introduction in the 1990s and the body of evidence comparing its clinical use to other volatiles. Obviously, given its lipid solubility, there's good theoretical reasons why desflurane should be a much better anesthetic agent. However, he suggests that real-world studies aren't hugely convincing as to its benefits. For example, he quotes this meta-analysis in a bariatric population, i.e. the very group of patients where desflurane should show its best benefits. Singh and colleagues looked at 5 trials comparing the emergence from bariatric anesthesia with sevoflurane compared to desflurane. Admittedly, desflurane emergence is clearly faster, but the time saved at extubation isn't dramatic and wouldn't, for example, enable you to add another case to the typical bariatric list. From our perspective, time to extubation is rarely the rate-limiting factor in our lists, and certainly not the rate-limiting factor in discharging patients from hospital. Regardless, even if it was, there are other alternatives such as TIVA with BIS, which we'll come on to, that can facilitate an emergence that is just as fast, if not faster, than desflurane. Mayer goes on to discuss the suggestion that desflurane's lipid solubility makes it less likely to impair cognition in the elderly. And he quotes Chen's meta-analysis that looked at 5 trials comparing sevoflurane to desflurane in an elderly population. Again, admittedly, the initial emergence with desflurane is clearly faster, but there was no evidence to suggest that there is a difference in subsequent later recovery or in the incidence of postoperative cognitive dysfunction. But clearly, the reason that most people are interested in the topic of desflurane is its effect upon the global environment. The NHS is a huge producer of carbon emissions. In of itself, the NHS produces more CO2 than Heathrow Airport, the world's 3rd busiest airport. And 2% of those carbon emissions from the NHS are directly caused by our anaesthetic gases. Needless to say, a 2% slice of a giant pie is still a huge amount of pie. All volatile anesthetic gases are greenhouse gases, but they're not all the same. Sevoflurane has a 20-year global warming potential that is 349 times that of carbon dioxide. However, desflurane's global warming potential is more than 3,700 times that of carbon dioxide. And at just 1 Mach hour of desflurane at 1 litre of fresh gas flow is 13 times worse than 2 litres of sevoflurane. To put it another way, 1 hour of desflurane use is equivalent to driving 370 kilometers in an average car. Regardless of how you look at it, reducing desflurane use will reduce the carbon footprint of your anesthetic. Mayer's second argument is that of cost, and again, I fully admit that anesthetics in context are extremely cheap in comparison to any other theatre speciality. But that said, almost regardless of fresh gas flow, desflurane is significantly more expensive than sevoflurane. Even at minimal flow anesthesia, desflurane is always more expensive. The question then arises, what about the costs compared to TIVA, which would be an alternative to desflurane for many anaesthetists? Mayer quotes a Hungarian paper which looked at the total costs of anesthetics, including all of the consumables. Teva was only marginally more expensive than a Acebo anesthetic, and therefore Mayer extrapolates that as a Desflurane anesthetic is always more expensive than a sevoflurane anesthetic, it is highly likely that Teva is cheaper than a Desflurane anesthetic. In full openness, although BIS does allow a faster emergence, it significantly increases the cost of any type of anesthetic, and it is possible that a Desflurane anesthetic without BIS will be cheaper than a Teva anesthetic with BIS. However, Mayer highlights the case of this tertiary center in North Carolina that was able to reduce their volatile costs by $1.8 million over 7 years, partly by reducing their dependence on Desflurane. He also goes on to make not only a pure institutional economic argument, but he quantifies the societal cost of Desflurane. Regardless of low flows, Desflurane is always significantly more costly to society in terms of future economic harm. He briefly discusses the role of increased efficiency of Desflurane in the pandemic and its contribution to the pandemic recovery. The fact that Desflurane is significantly associated with increased coughing does not make this a hugely strong argument. Mayer points out that many US institutions have now already given up Desflurane completely. He suggests that all patients, regardless of their complexity, can have a GA without the need for Desflurane. However, clearly this might not always be popular with a few individual clinicians. The NHS's long-term plan commits us to reduce our direct carbon footprint by 51% by 2025, and 2% of this reduction is to be achieved by reducing the use of Desflurane in anesthetics. This September, the NHS has already met its target of reducing Desflurane to less than 10% of all anesthetic gases used. Mayer points out that it is rare that a single intervention can either significantly reduce cost or reduce environmental harm. However, getting rid of Desflurane can actually do both, with no appreciable downside for patients. Clearly, it is important that we shouldn't replace Desflurane with increased use of nitrous oxide in theatres, which arguably has an even greater greenhouse effect. The issue was briefly raised here at QE 2 years ago. Although the department was broadly in favour, there were concerns raised by a few enthusiastic users of Desflurane. They argued that the environmental effect at low flows was relatively trivial, and the amount of Desflurane-related air pollution at QE really wouldn't have a significant wider impact. In the interests of respecting clinicians' autonomy, the argument wasn't pressed. However, in the last year, even though it is now only a minority of anaesthetists that use Desflurane here at QE, our consumption of Des was more than twice that of UHL, where our bariatric lists happen. We've used 46 bottles in the last 1 year alone, which is the equivalent of burning more than 20 tons of coal. I would argue that with the greatest of respect, we don't have time to wait until everybody catches up with the consensus of both the anaesthetic profession and the wider NHS. It is far from the only step that we need to take to make our organisation and our department more sustainable. At Thursday's clinical governance meeting, you'll hear more on this topic. However, I think it is a relatively quick win. On Friday, UHL have already agreed to do without Desflurane. I think it's time that we should listen to the science, and we should also give up our Desflurane addiction. Thank you so much.